Miss Marple, the silence she paid for. Dear listeners, welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm Ali, and it's such a joy to know you're spending this time with us. I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening from? And was your day a calm one or a busy one? Write a little note in the comments, and be sure to subscribe for our daily stories. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The withdrawal the morning had begun with frost on the hedgerows, and by 11 o'clock a pale November sun had done little to dispel the chill that hung over the village of St. Mary Mead. Miss Jane Marple, equipped with her shopping basket and a resolute expression, made her way down the high street toward the bank. She had observed over many years that Tuesday mornings were the quietest time to conduct one's banking affairs. When the queues were short, and Mr. Petton, the bank manager, was at his most accommodating. The bank itself was a modest brick building that had served the village for 3 generations. Its interior smelled of old ledgers and furniture polish, and the wooden counter bore the smooth indentations of countless hands that had rested upon it while conducting their business. Miss Marple appreciated these signs of continuity. They spoke of trust, of established patterns, of a world where one's financial affairs were conducted with discretion and propriety. She had come to deposit a small cheque from her nephew Raymond, who, despite his modern ways in his residence in London, still remembered his elderly aunt with touching regularity. As she stood at the counter completing the necessary paperwork, with the careful penmanship of her generation, she became aware of a certain tension in the air. Mrs. Agnes Merton stood at the adjacent counter, speaking in low tones to Mr. Petton himself. This was unusual. Mrs. Merton was a woman who normally conducted her modest transactions with the junior clerk, a pleasant young man named Timothy, who blushed when a Varanian thanked him. That the bank manager had emerged from his private office suggested business of some significance. Miss Marple did not stare. That would have been vulgar, and besides, one learned far more by appearing not to notice. She accompanied herself with her deposit slip, but her peripheral vision, still remarkably acute, took in every detail. Mrs. Merton was a woman of perhaps 50 years, with the kind of gentle, unassuming manner that made her ideally suited to the charitable work for which she was known throughout the village. She served on the church committee, organized the annual fete with quiet efficiency, and managed the school fund with the same careful attention she brought to her own modest household accounts. Her husband had died some 5 years earlier, leaving her comfortably, if not lavishly, provided for. She lived in Rose Cottage, a pretty little dwelling at the edge of the village, and was universally regarded as a model of respectability and kindness. Yet this morning, Mrs. Merton did not look like herself at all. Her face was pale, almost grey beneath the brim of her sensible felt hat. Her hands, as they accepted the stack of banknotes from Mr. Petton, trembled visibly. Miss Marple noticed that she wore no gloves, though the morning was cold, and that her fingernails had been bitten down to the quick. This, in a woman who had always presented herself with such care, was remarkable. Mr. Petton's voice, though lowered, carried to Miss Marple's attentive ears. "Are you quite certain, Mrs. Merton? It's a substantial sum to withdraw in cash. We could arrange a banker's draft, or perhaps a series of checks might be more suitable." "No." The word came out more sharply than Mrs. Merton likely intended. She softened her tone immediately. "No, thank you, Mr. Petton. Cash will be necessary. I have my reasons." Of course. Mr. Petton's professional discretion was admirable, but Miss Marple detected a note of concern beneath his accommodation. "I merely wish to ensure that you would consider the security aspect. Suchan amount carried in person. I shall be perfectly safe, Mrs. Merton said, though her trembling hand suggested she felt anything but safe. She drew a brown envelope from her handbag and began folding the notes into it with movements that were both hurried and one note fell to the floor, and she snatched it up as though it was something precious and dangerous all at once. Miss Marple completed her own transaction with Timothy, who had been waiting patiently while she observed Thessany before her. As she tucked her deposit receipt into her handbag, she glanced once more toward Mrs. Merton. The woman had sealed the envelope and pressed it into her handbag with both hands, as though to ensure it could not escape her eyes. When they briefly met, Miss Marple's held an expression that the elderly spinster had seen before. It reminded her of Lucy Archer. The housemaid at the Manor Ho had stolen a brooch to pay off a young man who claimed to have compromising letters. That look spoke of fear, of desperation, and of a terrible secret that weighed upon the soul. Miss Marple offered a small, gentle smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Merton. Such a cold day, is it not?" "Oh, Miss Marpleford, yes, yes, very cold." Mrs. Merton's reply was disjointed, distracted. She did not pause for the customary exchange of pleasantries, but instead moved quickly toward the door. Then, as though suddenly aware of how her behavior might appear, she stopped and added, "I hope you're keeping well." "Very well, thank you. And yourself?" "Quite well. Quite well, indeed." The lie was transparent, but Miss Marple did not challenge it. Mrs. Merton clutched her handbag more tightly and added in a rush, "I must be going. So much to do the committee meeting, you know, and other matters totened too." But there was no committee meeting scheduled for that day. Miss Marple knew the church calendar as well as she knew her own garden. Mrs. Merton did not leave by the main entrance, which opened directly onto the high street where she might encounter any number of neighbours. Instead, she moved toward the side door that led to a narrow lane running behind the shops. It was a route one might choose if one wished to avoid observation, if one were carrying something precious and did not wish to advertise the fact. The door closed softly behind her, and Miss Marple stood for a moment in the quiet of the bank, considering what she had witnessed. "A troubled woman," Mr. Petton remarked quietly, having approached Miss Marple once his other client had departed. His professional discretion normally prevented such comments, but he appeared genuinely concerned. "I do hope she knows what she's doing." "I am certain she believes she does," Miss Marple replied, though belief and wisdom are not always found in the same place. "Tell me, Mr. Petton, has Mrs. Merton made such large withdrawals before?" The bank manager hesitated, then shook his head slightly. "I should not discuss another client's affairs, Miss Marple, but given your long-standing acquaintance with Mrs. Merton and my own concern for her welfare—" "Oh, no. This was most unusual indeed." Miss Marple thanked him and made her way out into the cold November air. She walked slowly, her shopping basket over her arm, her mind working with the methodical precision that had unravelled many a village mystery over the years. She thought of young woman in her own youth, who had withdrawn her savings to pay a man claiming her brother owed him money. Thebra had been innocent, the man a fraud, and the young woman had lost everything. She thought of the grocer's wife, who had taken money from the till to silence someone who threatened to reveal an ancient indiscretion. These stories, Miss Marple had learned, followed patterns as reliable as the seasons. Someone was making Mrs. Merton pay for something. Someone knew a secret that she could not afford to have revealed. The money in that brown envelope was the price of silence. That silence, in Miss Marple's long experience, was a commodity that never stayed purchased for long. Those who sold it once would always return for more, and those who bought it would eventually find themselves trapped in a prison of their own making. As she turned Thekina toward her own cottage, Miss Marple caught one last glimpse of Mrs. Merton in the distance, hurrying along the lane with her handbag clutched against her chest. Her gait was that of someone pursued, though the lane behind her was empty. Miss Marple walked on, but her mind remained occupied with the pale, frightened face and the trembling hands. Something was very wrong in St. Mary Mead, and Agnes Merton was at the heart of it. She could only hope that whatever drove the woman to withdraw such a somewhat of a secret she was protecting, or payment she was making, would resolve itself before tragedy struck. But hope, Miss Marple knew from long experience, was not always sufficient protection against the darker impulses of human nature. Chapter 2. A Quiet. Death news reached Miss Marple as she was deadheading the last of her chrysanthemums. On Wednesday morning, Mrs. Dane, who kept the grocer's shop and possessed an unerring instinct for village intelligence, arrived at the garden gate, breathless with information. In the cold, Miss Marple, "Oh, Miss Marple, have you heard? Mrs. Merton is dead." The secateurs still in Miss Marple's hand. She had been half expecting something of the sort, though she would have preferred to be wrong. Dead? When did this happen? Last night, they say. Found her this morning on the footpath near Rose Cottage. Dr. Haydock is there now, and Constable Polt. They're saying she fell in the dark pour. Sol knocked her head on a stone, with a lantern smashed beside her. Miss Marple carefully placed her secateurs in the gardening basket and removed her gloves with deliberate movements. Her mind was already working through the implications of what she had heard. How very tragic. Who discovered her? Young Billy Watkins, going to his work at the farm, nearly stepped on her. He said she was lying there in the grey light. Gave him a terrible fright. I imagine it would. Miss Marple glanced toward the cottage at the end of the lane, where even from this distance she could see small figures gathered. Double quotes, Mrs. Dane. Would you think it very forward of me to call at Rose? I should like to pay my respects, and Mrs. Merton had no close family in the village. Someone ought to see that things are done properly. Mrs. Dane approved of this sentiment immediately. Very proper of you, Miss. Very proper indeed. Poor Mrs. Merton, and her always so careful about everything. It seems wrong somehow, doesn't it? A woman like that coming to such an end. It does indeed seem wrong, Miss Marple agreed quietly. It seems wrong in several respects. She made her way to Rose Cottage within the quarter hour, her mind occupied with scenes she had witnessed at the bank. 24 hours ago, Mrs. Merton had withdrawn a substantial sum of money while exhibiting every sign of fear and distress. Now she was dead, discovered in a footpath in circumstances that were being called accidental. The cottage stood at the far edge of the village, where the lane narrowed and gave way to open fields. It was a pretty dwelling, well maintained, with a small garden that Mrs. Merton had tended with care. Now it wore an air of abandonment, though it already knew its mistress would not. Return. Dr. Haydock emerged from the cottage gate as Miss Marple approached. He was a brisk, competent man in his 50s, who had attended most of St. Mary Mead through illnesses, major and minor. His expression was grave, but not, Miss Marple noted, particularly troubled. Miss Marple's sad business, this. Very sad. May I ask what happened? Simple enough, I'm afraid. Mrs. Merton appears to have gone out after dark, carrying a lantern. The path there is uneven in places, and in the dark one might easily miss one's footing. She fell, struck her head on one of those stones bordering the path, and died almost instantly. The lantern shattered when she dropped it. After dark, you say? Miss Marple's tone was thoughtful. How curious. Mrs. Merton was not in the habit of walking after dark, was she? Dr. Haydock paused, considering. I couldn't say as to her habits, but people do go out at night occasionally, Miss Marple. Perhaps she had forgotten something, or wished to tape the air. Perhaps Miss Marple did not voice her doubts. Instead, she asked, where exactly was she found? Just there. The doctor pointed to a spot some 20 yards down the path, where Constable Polk could be seen examining the ground. Between her cottage and Thelen that leads to the church, not far from home at all, poor woman. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the indicated spot, her keen eyes taking in every detail. The path was indidunavan, with stones set at intervals to mark its edges. One of these stones held a dark stain that might have been blood, though the frost had obscured much. The shattered remains of a lantern lay scattered on the ground, and the earth showed signs of disturbance. But it was what Miss Marple did not see that interested her most. There was no sign of Mrs. Merton's handbag. Theban envelope, so carefully protected and clutched close yesterday morning, was nowhere in evidence. Constable Polk, a solid man with the steady temperament required for keeping the peace in a village where serious crime was rare, nodded respectfully to Miss Marple. Morning, Miss Marple. Terrible thing, this. Indeed, it is, Constable. I wonder, was Mrs. Merton carrying anything when she was found? A handbag, perhaps. The constable consulted his notebook. A gesture Miss Marple appreciated for its thoroughness. No handbag found at the scene. Miss Marple, she had her keys in her coat pocket and a handkerchief band. A handkerchief. That was all. How interesting. Mrs. Merton always carried her handbag. I cannot recall ever seeing her without it. Well, she was only going a short distance from her cottage. Constable Polk suggested reasonably. Perhaps she didn't think she needed it. Perhaps not. Miss Marple did not argue the point. She had learned that introducing doubts too early often caused people to become defensive of their initial conclusions. Instead, she asked, what time do you estimate Thisha Penn? Dr. Haydock places the time of death somewhere between 8 and 10 o'clock. After full dark, certainly the lantern suggests she knew it would be dark when she went out. Which suggests an appointment, Miss Marple murmured, almost to herself. Or an assignation. I beg your pardon, Miss Marple. I merely observe that one does not usually venture out after dark on a November evening without a specific purpose. Mrs. Merton was not a woman to spontaneous actions. The constable looked uncomfortable, as people often did when their assumptions were questioned. Could be she heard a noise or saw something that concerned her. Could be any number of innocent explanations. Could be, Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. She turned her attention to the catechite self. I wonder if I might be permitted to enter. I should like to help arrange things, if there are matters that need attending to. Mrs. Merton had no family nearby, as you know. Dr. Haydock, who had joined them, nodded his approval. Very good of you, Miss Marple. The vicar mentioned that someone should see to closing up the house properly. I see no objection to you, Constable. No objection at all. Very proper of you, Miss Marple. She entered the cottage with the reverence due to a place where life had recently departed. The interior was neat and well ordered. As she had expected, Mrs. Merton had been a woman who kept her surroundings as carefully controlled as she had kept her emotions. The sitting room showed signs of recent occupation. A book lay open on the small table beside the chair where Mrs. Merton customarily sat, a bookmark indicating she had been midway through a novel by Mrs. Humphrey Ward. A teacup rested on its saucer, the tea long since cold. A small fire had burned down to ashes in the grate. These details painted a picture of an ordinary evening interrupted. Miss Marple moved slowly through the room, her eyes missing nothing. She noticed that the clock on the mantelpiece had stopped at 9:15. Whether this was significant or merely coincidental remained to be seen. In the small dining room, which Mrs. Merton had also used as a study, a writing desk stood beneath the window. Miss Marple examined it with interest. The surface was clear except for a blotter and an inkstand. The drawers, when she tried them, were locked. Looking for something specific, Constable Polk had followed her inside, maintaining a respectful distance, but clearly curious about her methodical examination. Not at all. I'm simply trying to understand Mrs. Merton's state of mind. The condition of a person's dwelling often tells us much about their inner life. And what does this tell you? That Mrs. Merton was a woman of method. Nothing here is out of place. Yet yesterday, when I saw her at the bank, she was deeply distressed about something. That distress does not show in her surroundings, which suggests she was very good at maintaining appearances, even under strain. She paused beside the fireplace, noting they were not entirely consistent with the wood that lay stacked beside the hearth. Among the grey ash were darker fragments, the kind that paper made when burned. She bent slightly as though adjusting her glove, and her sharp eyes caught sight of something that confirmed her suspicion. A small corner of paper had escaped complete destruction, bearing what looked like the printed heading of an official document. Such a tragedy, she sat aloud, straightening. And accidents are always particularly tragic, are they not, Constable? Because they seem so arbitrary, so purposeless. That's the nature of accidents, Miss Marple. No rhyme or reason to them, indeed. She moved toward the window, looking out at the path where Mrs. Merton had died. Though I have always found it curious how accidents so often choose their victims with remarkable precision. One might almost think they had intelligence behind them. The constable looked puzzled, but Miss Marple did not elaborate. She had learned what she needed to know for the moment. Mrs. Merton had been afraid. She had withdrawn money she could not afford to lose. She had burned documents in her fireplace, and she'd gone out after dark to meet someone doomed despite the fact that she never walked after dusk. These were not the actions of a woman who then suffered an unfortunate accident. These were the actions of a woman being driven to desperate measures. As Miss Marple left the cottage, offering her condolences and her services to Constable Polk, her mind was quite made up. Agnes Merton had not died by accident. Someone had taken that money from her, and in the taking or in what followed after, Mrs. Merton had died. The village might be satisfied with the comfortable explanation of an accidental fall, but Miss Marple, who had seen the fear in Mrs. Merton's eyes and the trembling of her hands, knew better. Someone in St. Mary Mead had blood on their hands and a brown envelope full of banknotes in their possession. Chapter 3. The envelope of banknotes. Funeral took place on a grey Saturday afternoon, with a thin rain falling that seemed entirely appropriato the solemnity of the occasion. Miss Marple attended in her best black coat, observing the small gathering with her customary attention to detail. The church was less than half full, which spoke both to Mrs. Merton's quiet nature and to the fact that she had no family to mourn her. The vicar, Mr. Clement, conducted the service with his usual gentle dignity. speaking of Mrs. Merton's charitable works and her dedication to the parish. It was all very proper and very sad. Miss Marple noted who was present and, more significantly, who was not. Mr. Stumberton, the school treasurer, sat near the back, his expression suitably grave. Miss Hardy, Mrs. Merton's nearest neighbour, wept quietly into her handkerchief. Dr. Haydock attended, as did Constable Polk. The usual collection of village worthies filled the remaining pews. Paying their respects to a woman Woe had lived among them without causing any particular notice. After the service, as the small cortege made its way to the churchyard, Miss Marple found herself walking beside Miss Hardy, a thin, nervous woman of indeterminate-eyed age who lived in the cottage adjacent to Rose Cottage. "Such a shock," Miss Hardy murmured, dabbing at her eyes. "Such a terrible shock, and to think I heard nothing that night." "Nothing at all. You heard nothing unusual?" Miss Marple asked gently. "No sounds of distress, no calls for help?" "Nothing. I retired early with a headache, and I'm afraid I took a sleeping draught. I heard nothing until young Billy Watkins came running to fetch help in the morning." She shook her head sorrowfully. "If only I had been more alert. Perhaps Emot had been of assistance." "I think it unlikely," Miss Marple said quietly. "From what Dr. Haydock said, Mrs. Merton would have died very quickly. There was nothing anyone could have done." This seemed to comfort Miss Hardy slightly, and she walked on in silence. The following Monday, Miss Marple received the vicar's permission to assist in sorting through Mrs. Merton's effects. There were small bequests to be identified and distributed, and someone needed to ensure the cottage was properly secured until matters of theestate could be settled. As Mrs. Merton's sister was based in the market town some miles away, and as these things always took time, Miss Marple's offer was gratefully accepted. She arrived at Rose Cottage in the morning, equipped with her knitting bag and a practical frame of mind. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, accompanied her initially, but was called away after half an hour to attend to parish matters, leaving Miss Marple alone to continue the work. The cottage felt different now, heavy with the silence of abandonment. Miss Marple worked methodically through the sitting room, sorting books and small ornaments, making notes of items that might be of value to the church sale or suitable as bequests to those Mrs. Merton had mentioned favourably in conversation over years. It was in the dining room at the writing desks. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to something that had puzzled her during her first visit. The desk had 3 drawers, all of which had been locked. She had not, at that time, felt it appropriate to press the matter. Now, acting with the vicar's authority to inventory the estate, she felt no such compunction. The keys had been found in Mrs. Merton's coat pocket on the night she died. Miss Marple had asked Constable Polk for them, explaining that she would need access to the desk to locate any relevant papers. The constable, seeing no harm in this, had handed them over readily enough. The first drawer contained the usual domestic correspondence, bills paid and receipted, a few letters from a cousin in Bournemouth, a membership card for the Women's Institute. The second drawer held household accounts, all meticulously kept in Mrs. Merton's neat hand. Nothing remarkable there. It wastes third drawer, the deepest one that proved most interesting. Or rather, it was what appeared to be the third drawer. Miss Marple had noticed during her first visit that the exterior dimensions of the desk did not quite match the interior capacity of the drawers. The discrepancy was small. Beauty was there now. With the keys in hand and time to examine the piece more carefully, she discovered why. The back panel of the third drawer, when pressed in just the right place, slid aside to reveal a hidden compartment Inside were 3 items. The first was the receipt from the bank for Mrs. Merton's withdrawal, dated the Tuesday before her death. The amount was noted clearly, £250, substantial sum indeed for a woman of Mrs. Merton's modest means. The second item was a single scrap of paper torn from a larger sheet. The handwriting was not Mrs. Merton's. It was angular, masculine, written with a heavy hand that had pressed the pen deep into the paper. The message was brief and chilling. I will be there at dusk. Bring what is owed. No signature, no date, but implication was unmistakable. The third item was a small notebook bound in black leather. Miss Marple opened it carefully. Inside, in Mrs. Merton's meticulous handwriting, were a series of entries dating back nearly 6 months. Each entry consisted of a date and a sum of money. The amounts varied, but they followed a clear pattern: £20, then £30, then £40. The sums had been growing larger with each passing month. The final entry, dated the day before Mrs. Merton's death, read simply, "Final payment, £250. This must end." Miss Marple sat very still, the notebook open in her hands. She thought of the young maid she had known in her youth who had paid, and paid again to keep a secret that, in the end, had been no secret at all. She thought of the shopkeeper who had embezzled from his employer and then found himself caught in an endless spiral of payments to the man who discovered his crime. Blackmail, that ancient and cruel transaction, where one person's fear became another person's profit. Mrs. Merton had been paying someone for their silence. The amounts had grown steadily, as they always did. Blackmailers were never satisfied with a single payment. The very nature of the crime ensured that they would return again and again, each time demanding more. But Mrs. Merton had apparently decided to make a final payment. £250, withdrawn in cash, intended to end the torment once and for all, only it had not ended. Instead, Mrs. Merton had died. Miss Marple carefully folded the note and placed it along with the receipt and the notebook into her handbag. The situms were evidence, and there they would need to be shown to Constable Polk. But first she wanted to think about what they meant. The note itself was revealing. I will be there at dusk. Bring what is owed. This was not the language of someone offering a choice. It was a command, cold and final. And the meeting place, though not specified in the note, was clearly meant to be along the footpath where Mrs. Merton had died. Someone had lured her out after dark, knowing she would come because she was desperate to end the payments. Someone had taken the money from her handbag and left her lying dead on the cold ground. Miss Marple rose from the desk and moved to the fireplace, where she knelt with some difficulty to examine the ashes she had noticed during her first visit. The fragments of burned paper were still there, undisturbed. She took a knitting needle from her bag and carefully extracted several pieces, laying them on a sheet of notepaper. Most were too badly burned to read, but one fragment, slightly larger than the others, bore a partial letterhead. She could make out words: St. Mary Mead School Fund, and below that, what appeared to be part of a signature. The name was incomplete, but the letters Burr were clearly visible. Burton, Mr. Burton, the school treasurer. Miss Marple sat back in her heels, her mind working through the implications. Mrs. Merton had managed the school fund alongside Mr. Burton. She had access to the accounts. If she had discovered some irregularities, some theft or falsification of records, she would have faced a terrible choice. To expose the crime would be to bring scandal upon the school and shame upon the village. To remain silent would be to become complicit in the theft. But what if she had tried a third option? What if she had confronted Mr. Burton privately, hoping to resolve the matter quietly. And what if Mr. Burton, instead of accepting responsibility, had turned the situation to his advantage? A terrible choice, Miss Marple murmured to herself, carefully gathering the fragments of burned paper. Between scandal and safety, and she chased safety, poor woman. She chose to pay rather than to expose. But silence, once purchased, must be purchased again and again. She placed the fragments carefully in an envelope and added it to her handbag along with the other items. Then she continued her inventory of the cottage, working with her usual methodical thoroughness. But her mind was far from the household linens and china she was cataloging. Someone in St. Mary. Mead was a thief and, quite possibly, a murderous someone, who had stolen from the school fund, had been discovered by Mrs. Merton, and then exploited her desire to avoid scandal. Someone who had demanded increasingly large sums until finalized mending, one last payment of £250, and then, having taken that payment, had ensured that Mrs. Merton would never be able to speak of it. Miss Marple finished her work at the cottage as the afternoon lights began to fade. She locked the door carefully behind her and made her way back through the village, her handbag heavier than usual with the weight of evidence it contained. Tomorrow she would speak with Constable Polk, but tonight she would think about Mr. Burton and his sudden prosperity, and about the kind afterman who would turn a woman's fear into profit and profit into murder. Chapter 4. The man at the post office. Miss Marple presented herself at the constabulary the following morning, Tuesday, carrying her handbag, and wearing an expression of gentle determination that Constable Polk had come to recognize over the years. It meant that Miss Marple had discovered something, and that he would be required to take it seriously whether he wished to or not. "Good morning, Constable. I wonder if I might have a word with you about Mrs. Merton's death." Constable Polk, who had been completing a report on a minor matter involving Mr. Hedges' wandering sheep, set down his pen with a mixture of resignation and curiosity. "Of course, Miss Marple, though I'm not sure what more there is to discuss. Dr. Haydacker's signed the death certificate, and the coroner has accepted it as accidental death." "Yes, I'm aware of that. Nevertheless, I think you should see what I found at Rose Cottage while sorting through Mrs. Merton's single quotes as effects." She opened her handbag and withdrew the items one by one, placing them on the constable's desk. With the care of someone laying out evidence at a trial, the bank receipt, the threatening note, the black notebook with its record of escalating payments, the envelope containing fragments of burned paper from the school fund. Constable Polk's expression changed as he examined each item. The comfortably courtesy that had marked his initial investigation gave way to something more troubled. "This is very serious, Miss Marple, very serious indeed. I rather thought it might be. This note, bring what is owed. That's blackmail, plain as day. And these payments in the notebook, going back 6 months. He shook his head slowly. Poor Mrs. Merton, to think she was suffering all this time, and none of us knew. People are remarkably skilled at concealing their distress when they feel they must, Miss Marple observed. Mrs. Merton was a woman who valued her reputation and that of the institution she served. She would have done anything to avoid scandal. And this burned paper from the school fund. The constable examined the fragments carefully. "You'll think there was some irregularities, some theft that Mrs. Merton discovered. I think it highly probable. The fragment shows Mr. Burton's signature or part of it. He is the school treasurer, as you know." Constable Polk was silent for a long moment, clearly troubled by the implications. "Mr. Burton is a respected member of the community, Miss Marple. I can't simply accuse him of theft and blackmail and possibly murder on the basis of a few burned scraps of paper. I'm not asking you to accuse anyone, Constable. I'm merely suggesting that certain inquiries might be made. Discreetly, of course. What sort of inquiries? Miss Marple considered. I wonder if the postmistress might have noticed anything unusual in the days before Mrs. Merton's death letters, delivered or posted. Strangers making inquiries. Mrs. Trimble notices a great deal from her position behind the counter. The constable's expression suggested he understood perfectly well that Miss Marple had already reached her own conclusions about what Mrs. Trimble might have noticed. Nevertheless, he rose from his desk with the air of a man accepting the inevitable. Very well, we'll go and have a word with Mrs. Trimble. Though mind you, Miss Marple, we must proceed carefully. If there's been a crime committed, we don't want to alert the guilty party before we have sufficient evidence. They walked together to the post office, which occupied a corner of the village store. Mrs. Trimble, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, who possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of village affairs, greeted them with immediate interest. Constable Polk, Miss Marple, what brings you both here together? Not that I'm not always pleased to see you, of course. Just a few questions about Mrs. Merton, Mrs. Trimble, the constable said. We're trying to piece together her movements in the days before her death. Miss Marple here recalls that Mrs. Merton posted a letter the week she died. Wounded if you might remember anything about it. Mrs. Trimble's expression grew thoughtful. Indeed, I do remember. It was last Tuesday, the same day, I believe, she went to the bank. She came in quite late in the afternoon, just before I was closing up. She seemed agitated, if you know what I mean, kept looking over her shoulder as though she thought someone might be watching her. Did you happen to notice the address on the letter? Miss Marple asked gently. I did, as a matter of fact. It struck me as odd. Becker's. The name wasn't familiar. It was addressed to a Mr. R. Collins, care of a hotel in Bristol, the Grand Hotel, if I recall correctly. No one by that name lives in the village, and I said as much to Mrs. Merton. She said it was a business matter, and left it at that. A hotel in Bristol, Constable Polk repeated, making notes. That is curious. There's something else, Mrs. Trimble continued, clearly pleased to be of assistance. 2 days before, that may be the Monday, a stranger came into the shop asking about Mrs. Merton, wanted to know where she lived, what her habits were, that sort of thing. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Can you describe this man? Tall. He was thin, with a sort of pinched look about the face. Wore an overcoat that had seen better days frayed at the cuffs. Said he was an old friend from her late husband's regiment. Wanted to call on her to pay his respects. Mrs. Trimble sniffed. I didn't believe him for a moment. Mrs. Merton's husband wasn't in a regiment. He worked for the railways all his life. Did you tell Mrs. Merton about this inquiry? The constablist, I did, the next time I saw her. She went quite pale and said I must have been mistaken, that she knew no one of that description, but she was frightened. I could tell. And did you see this man again? Miss Marple asked. I did, actually, the day before Mrs. Merton died, the Wednesday. I saw him walking past the shop, heading in the direction of Rose Cottage. He had his collar turned up and his hat pulled low, but I recognized the overcoat's same frayed cuffs. Constable Polk was writing rapidly in his notebook now, his earlier skepticism replaced by professional interest. You're certain it was the same man? Quite certain, Constable. I pride myself in my powers of observation. Indeed, you do, Mrs. Trimble, Miss Marple said warmly. Your evidence may prove extremely valuable. As they left post office, Constable Polk was silent for several moments, clearly thinking through what they had learned. Finally, he spoke. This puts a different complexion on matters, Miss Marple. A stranger making inquiries, following Mrs. Merton, and then she turns up dead. One need to find out who this Mr. R. Collins is, and what connection he had to Mrs. Merton. I suspect, Miss Marple said carefully, that Mr. Collins may be connected to Mr. Burton in some way. Thelator to Bristol. The inquiries about Mrs. Merton's movements suggests someone working in concert with Anna, doesn't it? You think Burton has an accomplice? I think it's a possibility worth exploring. Men who embezzle from institutions they're meant to safeguard often have assistants. Or at the very least previous experience in such matters, and blackmail of the sort Mrs. Merton suffered usually requires ascertain degree of skill. One must know how much to demand, when to apply pressure, how to ensure one's victim remained silent. They had reached the corner where their paths diverged. Constable Polk looked troubled, as well he might. What had seemed a straightforward accidental death had become something far more sinister. I'll make inquiries with the Grand Hotel in Bristol, he said. See if this Mr. Collins is still registered there, or if they have any information about him, and I'll need to have a word with Mr. Burton, though I'm not quite sure how to approach that particular conversation. Perhaps, Miss Marple suggested, you might begin by asking to review the school fund accounts. Purely routine, you understand, just ensuring everything is in order following Mrs. Merton's death. Since she was one of the fund managers, Mr. Burton could hardly object to that without raising suspicion. That's good thinking, Miss Marple. Very good thinking indeed. He hesitated, then added, You've done this sort of thing before, haven't you? Unraveling these village mysteries. I have observed human nature for a very long time, Constable, and I have found that people are remarkably consistent in their behavior. The patterns repeat themselves generation after generation. Greed, fear, desperation. These are universal qualities. One need only know what to look for. And what are you looking for now? Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, gazing toward the church spire that rose above the village rooftops. When she spoke, her voice was soft but certain. I am looking for a man who thought himself clever enough to steal from children's educations, desperate enough to blackmail a gentlewoman when she discovered his crime, and ruthless enough to kill her when she tried to escape his demands. Such a man will have left traces, Constable. One need only find them. She bid him good afternoon and made her way home. Hermond occupied with the image of a stranger in a frayed overcoat, watching Rose Cottage and waiting for darkness to fall. Someone had come from Bristol to collect a debt. Someone who had known exactly where Mrs. Merton would be, and when. Someone who had been told by Mr. Burton, perhaps, that the final payment was ready to be collected. But there was something else troubling Miss Marple, something that didn't quite fit. If Mr. Burton had sent an accomplice to collect the money, why had Mrs. Merton been killed? Dead women paid no blackmail. The murder seemed almost contrary to the blackmailer's interests. Unless, of course, the accomplice had decided to cut Mr. Burton out of the arrangement entirely, or unless the confrontation on that dark footpath had gone wrong in some way. Neither man had anticipated. Miss Marple settled into her chair by the window, her knitting in her lap, and watched the village go about its afternoon business. Somewhere among these familiar streets and cottages, a murderer walked free, but not if Miss Marple had anything to say about it for very much longer. Chapter 5. The Scorched Resi. from the Grand Hotel in Bristol arrived at the constabulary on Thursday morning. Constable Polk appeared at Miss Marple's door shortly after 11 o'clock. His expression a mixture of vindication and concern. "You are right, Miss Marple. There was a Mr. R. Collins registered at the Grand Hotel, checked in 2 weeks ago. Check it out the day after Mrs. Merton died. The description matches what Mrs. Trimble told us. Tall, thin, wore an old overcoat. The hotel staff remember him because he made several telephone calls to St. Mary Mead. They have a record of calls. To what number, I wonder? That's what I'm going to find out. The telephone exchange should have records." He paused, then added, "I'm also going to have that conversation with Mr. Burton this afternoon about the school fund accounts." "Would it be terribly improper," Miss Marple asked, "if I were to accompany you? I served on the church committee with Mrs. Burton for several years, and I am familiar with the general principles of fund management. I might notice irregularities that would escape a layman's attention." Constable Polk considered this. "I suppose it wouldn't hurt to have another pair of eyes." "Very well, Miss Marple. We'll call on Mr. Burton at 2 o'clock after school day has ended. He keeps an office there in the old schoolhouse building." At the appointed hour, they made their way to St. Mary Mead School, a sturdy Victorian building that had educated village children for 3 generations. Mr. Burton's office was a small room at the end of a corridor that smelled of chalk, dust and floor polish. Mr. Burton himself was a man of perhaps 40, with thinning hair and the slightly stooped posture of someone who spent long hours bent over a cap. He greeted them with a nervousness that might have been nothing more than natural discomfort, receiving an official visit, but which set Miss Marple's instincts humming. "Constable Polk." "Miss Marple, this ice. How may I help you?" "Just a routine matter, Mr. Burton," the constable said in his most official tone. "As you know, Mrs. Merton served as one of the managers of the school fund. In light of her unfortunate death, we need to ensure all the accounts are in order. Standard procedure in Thescases. Of course." "Of course." Burton moved behind his desk with movements that seemed overly deliberate. "I have the ledgers right here. Everything is perfectly in order, I assure you." He produced a large leather-bound ledger and appended it on the desk. Miss Marple stepped closer, her eyes scanning the neat columns of figures. Income from various sources. Expenditures for school supplies, maintenance. Salaries all appeared properly documented and balanced. "You see," Burton said, a note of relief in his voice. "All quite correct. Mrs. Merton and I maintained very careful records." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "Very careful records. I notice here, for example, that the fund received a donation of £50 from the Harvest Festival in October. That's quite generous. Yes, we were very pleased with the community's support. And here, a payment of £30 for new textbooks in September. Quite right." Miss Marple continued turning pages, her finger tracing down the columns. Constable Polk watched her, recognizing that she was searching for something specific, though Burton seemed to interpret her interest as mere thoroughness. Then Miss Marple paused, her finger resting on an entry from July. "This is interesting. A payment of £45 for repairs to the school roof. I don't recall hearing about any repairs." A faint sheen of perspiration appeared on Burton's forehead. "That was manor work, Miss Marple. Just a few loose tiles. Nothing that would have required much discussion. I see. And this contractor's named Mr. J. Petton. Would that be any relation to our bank manager?" "I really couldn't say. It's a common enough name, perhaps." Miss Marple turned another page. And here in August, another payment to the same contractor, £35 for window repairs. And again, in September, £40 for painting work. Mr. Baton appears to have been quite busy at the school. The building requires constant maintenance, as you know. Indeed, it does. Miss Marple looked up at Burton with her mild, penetrating gaze. I wonder might we see their sipes for these payments? Just for completeness' sake, I'm sure you maintain copies of all such documentation. The colour had drained from Burton's face. The receipts. Well, they should be in the file cabinet. Let me just... He moved to a tall filing cabinet in Theckener and began pulling open drawers with hands that trembled slightly. Papers rustled as he searched, growing more agitated with each passing moment. That's very odd. I'm certain they were here. Mrs. Merton always insisted on keeping receipts for everything. She must have that, perhaps she filed them elsewhere. Perhaps, Miss Marple said gently. She discovered that the receipts were not quite what they should be, that the payments recorded in the ledger did not match the actual work performed, or perhaps that no work was performed at all, and the receipts were entirely fictitious. Burton's face had gone from pale to red. I don't know what you're suggesting, Miss Marple, but I'm suggesting nothing. Mr. Burton, I'm merely observing that receipts appear to be missing, and that Mrs. Merton seemed quite distressed in the days before her death. I'm also observing that you have recently purchased an expensive motor car despite a salary that would seem insufficient for such an acquisition. Constable. Polk had been watching this exchange with growing attention. Now he spoke, his voice official and stern. Mr. Burton, I think you'd better tell us the truth. We know Mrs. Merton discovered irregularities in the fund accounts. We know she was paying someone to keep quiet about it. Was that someone you? Burton collapsed into his chair. His legs would no longer support him. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. It started so small, just a few pounds here and there to cover personal debts. I always meant to pay it back, but then there were more debts, more needs. The amounts grew larger. I created false receipts, falsy contractors. Mrs. Merton discovered it quite by accident 6 months ago when she was reconciling the accounts with the actual work completed at the school, and you convinced her to remain silent, Miss Marple said. I convinced her that revealing the theft would destroy their school's reputation, that donors would lose faith, that the children would suffer. She was so concerned about their children, always, and I told her I would repay everything given time. His voice broke, but time was what I didn't have. My creditors were pressing me. I needed more money quickly. So I asked her to help me, just small amounts at first, loans she could manage from her own resources, but she kept records of everything, and she began to realize I couldn't possibly repay her. She began to threaten exposure. So you blackmailed her instead, Constable Polk said grimly. Turned the situation around to make her the one at risk. I had no choice. If she had gone to the authorities, I would have been. I simply asked her to help me cover the gap until I could sort out my affairs. The payments were meant to be temporary. £250 is hardly temporary, Miss Marple observed. That was her final payment, wasn't it? She told you she would pay no more. Burton nodded miserably. She said she was going to the school board regardless, that she couldn't continue living with the deception. The final payment was meant to give me time to leave the country before she spoke to anyone. She was actually being merciful, giving me a chance to escape. But someone else had other ideas, Miss Marple said quietly. Someone who knew about the arrangement and decided to collect the money for himself. Tell us about Mr. Doc Collins. Mr. Burton, tell us about the man from Bristol. Burton's head jerked up, his eyes wide with something very like fear. How did you know about him? We know a great deal, Mr. Burton. We know he was making inquiries about Mrs. Merton in the village. We know he checked into a hotel in Bristol 2 weeks ago and made telephone calls to St. Mary Mead. Were those calls to you? Yes, the word came out as a groan. He was my former associate from my previous position in Bristol. I had to leave that post rather hurriedly after certain irregularities came to light. Collins knew about them when he learned of my situation here when he realized I was extracting payments from Mrs. Merton. He demanded a share. He threatened to expose everything if I didn't give him half of what I paid him. So you told him a Booth final payment, Constable Polk said. You told him where and when to collect it. No, I swear I didn't. I told him thought would be no more payments, that Mrs. Merton was going to the authorities regardless. I thought that would be the end of it, but he must have been watching her, following her movements. He must have intercepted her that night. Burton's voice trailed off into silence. Miss Marple and Constable Polk exchanged glances. Mr. Burton, the constable said formally, I'm placing you under arrest for theft and blackmail. As for Mrs. Merton's death, that remains under investigation, but you will need to remain available for further questioning. As Constable Polk called the trembling Burton away, Miss Marple remained in the office, looking at the ledger with its neat distinction. She thought of Mrs. Merton trapped between her desire to protect the school and her knowledge that she was enabling a criminal. It had been an impossible position, and she had made choices that reflected her essential goodness even as they led to her destruction. But there was still the question of Mr. Collins, the man in the frayed overcoat, who had come from Bristol seeking the profit. Had he killed Mrs. Merton for that envelope of banknotes? Or was there something else, some other element to this tragedy that had not yet been revealed? Miss Marple gathered her things and prepared to leave. Outside, the school children were playing in the yard, their voices high and innocent in the afternoon air. Somewhere, a man with blood on his hands walked free, and Miss Marple intended to find him. Chapter 6. The Whispering Wall with Mr. Burton in custody. The village buzzed with scandal and speculation. The revelation that the school treasurer had been embezzling funds and blackmailing. Mrs. Merton's senchok waves through St. Mary Mead's usually placid social structure. Yet Miss Marple, while satisfied that honor criminal had been apprehended, remained troubled by elements of the case that did not quite fit. She sat in her cottage on Friday morning, her knitting needles clicking with the steady rhythm that aided her thinking. Burton had confessed to theft and extortion, but he had seemed genuinely shocked by Mrs. Merton's death. His fear when Callinsnam was mentioned had been real enough, and his claim that he had told Collins there would be no more payments rang true to Miss Marple's experienced ear. So what had brought Collins to St. Mary Mead that Wednesday evening? And what had transpired on the footpath near Rose Cottage? Miss Marple set down her knitting and reached for her coat. There was someone she needed to speak with, someone who lived close enough to Rose Cottage to have heard or seen some things for. She made her way through the village, nodding to the various residents who greeted her, with the mixture of respect and curiosity that her involvement in Burton's arrest had generated. By the time she reached the lane leading to the schoolhouse, the morning sun had broken through the clouds, casting long shadows across the old stone walls. The school itself was a handsome building set back from the lane with a low stone wall. running along its perimeter. This wall, Miss Marple knew, separated their school grounds from the narrow path that ran behind it. The path was a shortcut many villagers used when walking between the church and the cottages at the far end of the village. Miss Marple paused beside the wall, examining it with interest. It was ancient stonework, mortared together generations ago, standing perhaps 4 feet high. She noticed something curious about its construction. The stones were laid in such a way that small gaps appeared at regular intervals, presumably for drainage. On an impulse, she walked round to the school side of the wall and stood close to it, as one might while waiting for someone or seeking shelter from the wind. Then she called out softly, "Good morning, Mrs. Dane." There was no one there, of course, but from the other side of the wall, from the path beyond, came a startled response. "Miss Marple is." Miss Marple smiled. Mrs. Dane, the grocer's wife, had been walking along the path and had heard her voice quite clearly through the wall. "Indeed it is. Mrs. Dane, I was just testing something. Would you be so kind as to walk a bit further along the path and speak in a normal conversational tone? I should like to conduct a small experiment." Mrs. Dane, intrigued, complied. As she walked along the path, continuing to chat about the weather and the shocking news about Mr. Burton, Miss Marple followed along on the school side of the wall. Every word came through with remarkable clarity. The stone structure acted as a conduit for sound, carrying voices from one side to the other with little diminishment. After thanking Mrs. Dane and waiting for her to continue on her way, Miss Marple remained by the wall, thinking, if sound carried so well through the stone, then anyone standing here on a quiet evening might overhear conversations from the path beyond, or, conversely, anyone on the path might hear voices from the school grounds. She made her way to the school entrance and found Miss Patterson, one of the younger teachers, preparing her classroom for the day's lessons. "Good morning, Miss Patterson. I wonder if I might ask you a rather odd question. Do you and the other teachers ever take your tea break outside near the Walthot borders, the path?" Miss Patterson looked surprised, but nodded. "Why, yes, Miss Marple. When the weather's fine, we sometimes step out for a bit of air. There's a bench just by the wall. We sit. It's rather pleasant, actually. And do you ever, that is, I'm not suggesting anything improper, you understand, but do you ever discuss school matters while sitting there?" A faint colour rose in Miss Patterson's cheeks. "Well, one does chat about this and that. Nothing confidential, of course, just the usual sort of conversation." "I'm sure," Miss Marple said gently. "But might you have discussed Merton's concerns about the school fund? Perhaps when she had that unfortunate argument with Mr. Burton." Miss Patterson's eyes widened. "How did you know about that?" "It was several days before she died. Mrs. Merton came to school looking quite distressed, and she and Mr. Burton went into his office. We could hear raised voices, though we couldn't make out the words. Afterward, when we were having our tea by the wall, Miss Thornley and I did discuss it. We were worried about Mrs. Merton. She looked so upset when she left. What did you say, if you don't mind my asking?" "Just that it seemed unlike them to quarrel, and that Mrs. Merton had looked almost frightened. Miss Thornley thought perhaps it was about money, since Mrs. Merton managed the fund along with Mr. Burton. We speculated that perhaps there was some shortage or confusion in the accounts." She paused. Then, dead quietly, "I suppose we were closer to the truth than we realized. And this conversation took place by the wall where someone walking on the path might have overheard you." "I suppose so. Yes, we weren't speaking loudly, but if someone were passing by." She trailed off, understanding dawning in her expression. You think someone overheard us? Someone who then knew about the trouble between Mrs. Merton and Mr. Burton? I think it's a possibility worth considering, Miss Marple said. Tell me, Miss Patterson, did you notice anyone unusual on the path that day? Perhaps a tall man in an overcoat with frayed cuffs. The young teacher thought for a moment. There was someone. I didn't pay much attention at the time, but yes. A man walked past while we were sitting there. He seemed to slow down as he passed. And I remember thinking it was odd, because he wasn't someone I recognized from theft. But then he moved on and I thought no more about it. Miss Marple thanked her and made her way back to the wall, standing once more in the spot where the teachers would have taken their tea. She closed her eyes, imagining the scene. Two teachers, worried about a colleague, discussing the argument they had witnessed. And on the other side of the wall, a man with knowledge of Burton's past crimes, listening carefully to every word. Collins would have learned several useful pieces of information from that overheard conversation. He would have known that Miss Merton had discovered something about the school fund. He would have known that she and Burton had quarrelled, and he would have realized that Burton's scheme was in danger of exposure. That knowledge would have given Collins leverage not just over Burton, but potentially over Mrs. Merton herself. Miss Marple walked slowly along the path, following the route that Collins might have taken. It led past Ross Cottage and eventually joined the main road to the church. Along the way, it passed several points where someone could pause unseen in the gathering dusk, watching the comings and goings at the cottage. She stopped at the spot where Mrs. Merton had died. The pathwise indeed uneven here, with loose stones that might cause someone to stumble in the dark. But the more Miss Marple examined the scene, the less she believed in a simple fall. A woman carrying a lantern, walking carefully along a familiar path, would not easily lose her footing unless something next had occurred, a confrontation. Perhaps someone blocking her way, demanding money, reaching for the handbag that held the brown envelope. In the struggle, the lantern would have fallen. Mrs. Merton, hurt and startled or pushed, would have lost her balance. Her head had struck the stone with fatal force. Murder perhaps saw something very close to it, not premeditated, but born of greed and desperation. In a moment of crisis, Miss Marple turned and walked back toward the village proper. She needed to speak with Constable Polk again. The telephone exchange should have records by now showing the calls between Collins and Burton, and there was still the matter of locating Collins himself. Ho had checked out of the Grand Hotel the day after Mrs. Merton died and vanished. As she passed the vicarage, she encountered Mr. Clement working in his garden. "Good morning, Miss Marple. I understand you've been instrumental in bringing Mr. Burton to justice. The entire parish is in your debt. I merely asked a few questions, Vicar, but I fear the matter is not yet entirely resolved. You refer to the Collins person, I take it." Constable Polk mentioned that there was another man involved. Indeed, a man who came from Bristol seeking profit and who may well have caused Mrs. Merton's death. "I don't suppose you saw any strangers in the village that Wednesday evening?" A tall man in a worn overcoat. The vicar shook his head. "I was at the diocesan meeting in Much Benham that evening, I'm afraid. Didn't return until quite late. But you might ask Miss Hardy. She lives right next to Rose Cottage, as you know. If anyone saw or heard something unusual, it would be her." Miss Marple considered this. Miss Hardy had claimed to have heard nothing the night of Mrs. Merton's death because she had taken a sleeping draught, but perhaps had seen something earlier in the evening before retiring. She made her way to Miss Hardy's cottage, a neat little dwelling that mirrored Rose Cottage in size and layout. Miss Hardy answered the door with red-rimmed eyes that suggested she had been weeping again. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to call. I've been so distressed about poor Mrs. Merton, and now to learn that Mr. Burton was tormenting her sight's almost too much to bear. It is indeed terrible," Miss Marple agreed. "Miss Hardy, I wonder if I might ask you about the evening Mrs. Merton died. I know you heard nothing after you retired, but before that, did you perhaps notice anyone near Rose? Any visitors or strangers about?" Miss Hardy dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Well, now that you mention it, there was someone. I saw him from my window as I was closing the curtains. A man standing on the path just at the point where it passes between our He seemed to be watching Mrs. Merton's house. Can you describe him? Tall, wearing a dark overcoat. I couldn't see his face clearly in the fading light. I assumed he was waiting for someone, perhaps. I didn't think much of it at the time. What time was this?" "Just before 7 o'clock. I remember because I was preparing my supper, and I always eat at 7. By the time I had taken my sleeping draught and retired, it must have he been 8. So Collins had been watching the cottage at 7 an hour and a half, before the estimated time of Mrs. Merton's death, waiting, perhaps, for full darkness to fall before approaching her for the money he believed Burton had promised him." Miss Marple thanked Miss Hardy and made her way thoughtfully home. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture of greed, fear, and tragic. But there was still one crucial element missing. Where was Collins now? And more importantly, did he still have the brown envelope that had cost Mrs. Merton her life? Chapter 7. The hidden lockbox Saturday morning brought a telegram to Miss Marple's cottage. It was from Constable Polk, requesting her present seat, the constabulary. At her earliest convenience, she arrived to find him in conversation with a well-dressed gentleman from the Bristol police, force a detective inspector named Craddock, Miss Marple. Constable Polk said with evident satisfaction, "Inspector Craddock has come down from Bristol regarding our Mr. Collins. It seems he's wanted there for fraud and theft." Inspector Craddock, a shrewd-looking man of middle age, regarded Miss Marple with interest. "Constable Polk speaks very highly of your investigative abilities, Miss Marple. He tells me you've been instrumental in unravelling this rather tangled case. You're very kind, Inspector. I have merely observed what was before me and drawn certain conclusions. Conclusions that led to Mr. Burton's arrest, I understand. And now we need to locate his accomplice, this Robert Collins." Craddock consulted his notes. Collins was dismissed from his position as an accountant in Bristol 3 years ago for falsifying records. He served 6 months in prison and has been involved in various dubious schemes since. We've been trying to locate him for questioning about another matter when we received Constable Polk's inquiry. "And have you any idea where he might be now?" Miss Marple asked. "We've been making inquiries. He left the Grand Hotel Themening after this Mrs. Merton died, paid his bill in cash, and took the train back to Bristol, but he never turned to his lodgings there. We believe he may have gone to ground somewhere, possibly with the money he took from the victim." 250 libras, Miss Marple murmured. A considerable sum for a man in Collins's circumstances enough to disappear for quite some time. Indeed, but we'll find him eventually. Men like Collins always surface sooner or later, usually when the money runs out. Craddock paused, then added, "Constable Polk mentioned that you had some thoughts about the circumstances of Mrs. Merton's death." Miss Marple chose her words carefully. I believe Mrs. Merton went out that evening, expecting to meet Mr. Burton and make her final payment. She had told Burton she would pay him enough to give him time to flee, for she reported the theft to the school board. But Burton claims he told Collins there would be no more money. I'm inclined to believe him on that point. So Collins decided to collect the money himself. Collins, following her movements, Craddock said. He had been watching Mrs. Merton's movements, knew about the arrangement. When Burton told him it was finished, he simply cut Burton out of the transaction. Precisely. And when Mrs. Merton encountered Jim instead of Burton on that dark path, there was a confrontation. Whether Collins intended to kill her, or whether Shell accidentally during a struggle, I cannot say, but the result was the same. Constable Polk nodded grimly. Murder or manslaughter, either way. He's responsible for her death. There's one thing that troubles me, Miss Marple said. If Collins has the money and has gone to ground, how do we prove he was here that night? We have Mrs. Trimble's testimony that she saw him in the village, and Miss Hardy saw someone watching Rose Cottage. But that's not quite enough to place him at the scene of Mrs. Merton's death, is it? It would be stronger if we could find the money, Craddock admitted. But if he's already spent it or hidden it away, that becomes difficult. Miss Marple was silent for a moment, her mind working. Then she said quietly, I wonder if we might return School to Mr. Burton's office specifically. There's something I should like to examine more carefully. The three of them made their way to the schoolhouse, which stood empty on this Saturday morning. Constable Polk unlocked Burton's office, and they entered the small, stuffy room where Burton had maintained his fraudulent records. Miss Marple stood in the centre of the room, turning slowly, her eye staking in every detail, the desk with its locked drawers, the filing cabinet where Burton had claimed the receipts should be, the small bookshelf holding various ledgers and reference books, and in the corner, a tall cupboard where school supplies were kept. Mr. Burton kept a lockbox here, she said. Behind the cupboard, that's where we found the forged receipts and the list of payments Mrs. Merton had made to him. I have the lockbox here, Constable Polk said, producing a metal box from the evidence he'd collected. The contents are accounted for. Yes, but where exactly was it kept? Miss Marple moved toward the cupboard. Would you help me move this forward, gentlemen? I should like to see the space behind it. With some effort, Craddock and Polk shifted the heavy cupboard away from the wall. Behind it, a space of perhaps 18 inches revealed itself dark and dusty. Miss Marple bent down, peering into the shadows with the aid of Constable Polk's torch. There's something else here, she said. Another box, pushed quite far back into the corner. Craddock reached in and extracted a smaller metal box, similar in style to the one that had held Burton's records, but distinctly separate from it. This box was locked, but the lock was a simple one. Constable Polk produced a small tool from his pocket and worked at it for a moment before it clicked open. Inside lay a collection of items that told their own story. First, a bundle of letters tied with string. Miss Marple carefully unfolded the top one and read it aloud. My dear Burton, I understand. You found yourself in a lucrative situation in your new position. Remember our arrangement in Bristoland. Remember that silence has its price. Yours, Collins. Blackmail, Craddock said grimly. Collins was extorting money from Burton Evanby. Mrs. Merton discovered the theft, which explains why Burton needed increasingly large sums. Miss Marple observed he was stealing from the school fund, not just to cover his debts, but to pay Collins as well. Beneath the letters lay a series of receipts. But these were not the forged school receipts. These documented payments made by Burton to Collins over the past year. Small amounts at first, then growing larger. The dates and sums were meticulously recorded as though Burton wanted proof of what Collins was extracting from him, and at the bottom of the box, wrapped in a piece of cloth, lay a brown manila envelope. Constable Polk lifted it out carefully and opened it. Inside were banknotes. He counted them quickly. £250, he said, his voice tight with This is the money Mrs. Merton withdrew from the bank. Miss Marple felt a cold certainty settle over her, which means Collins brought it here after Mrs. Merton died. He came to Thescal and hid it in Burton's office. But why? Craddock asked. Why not simply keep it himself? Because, Miss Marple said slowly, working through the implications. He wanted Burton to be implicated in Mrs. Merton's death. Collins took the money from her, yes, but he couldn't risk being caught with it. If he hid it here in Burton's private space and the body was discovered with the envelope missing, suspicion would fall on Burton. Collins could then retrieve the money later, once the investigation had concluded and Burton was arrested. Clever, Craddock admitted grudgingly. Ruthless, but clever. Except that he didn't count on us finding this secondary hiding place, Constable Polk added. He assumed we'd find the first lockbox with Burton's records and be satisfied with that. Miss Marple examined the envelope carefully. There's something else. Look at the corner here where there's a small tear and these faint marks that might better read blood. Craddock took the envelope and studied it under the better light from the window. You're right. This envelope was present when Mrs. Merton fell. The blood is hers, which definitively connects Collins to her death, Miss Marple said. He took this from her handbag, either during or immediately after the fatal fall. Then rather than fleeing immediately, he came here to hide it. That suggests he had Aki to the school or knew how to get in. Burton might have given him a key, Constable Polk suggested, or told him where one was hidden. We'll need to question Burton about that, Craddock said, and we'll need to intensify our search for Collins. With this evidence, we can charge him with Mrs. Merton's death. Whether it's murder or manslaughter will be for the court to decide, but either way, he'll face justice. Miss Marple turned away from the hiding place, her expression thoughtful. There's one more thing that troubles me, Inspector. Collins checked out of his hotel the morning after Mrs. Merton died, yet he must have hidden this money here either that night or very early the next morning before the body was discovered. That suggests careful planning, cool head despite having just caused a woman's death. Some Minari capable of great coldness when it serves their interests. Craddock observed. Indeed, they are. Miss Marple's voice was soft, almost sad. Mrs. Merton tried to protect the school's reputation, tried to handle the situation quietly and with mercy. She even offered Burton money to escape, and for her kindness. For her desire to avoid scandal, she was killed by a man who saw her only as a source of profit. The three of them stood in silence for a moment, in that small office where so much deception had been planned and executed. Then Craddock gathered up the lockbox and its contents as evidence. We'll find Collins. Miss Marple, he said, with quiet determination. Men like him always make a mistake, eventually end when he does. We'll be waiting. As they left the school, Miss Marple glanced back at the old stone building. Generations of children had learned their lessons here, innocent of the darkness that had lurked in Theatreser's office. Soon, she hoped, that darkness would be brought fully into Thelatand. Mrs. Merton's death would be answered with justice. But first, they had to find Robert Collins. Chapter 8. The alibi that shifted the telegram from Inspector Craddock arrived on Monday afternoon. Miss Marple read it with considerable interest while standing in her hallway, still wearing her gardening gloves. Collins located. Returning Bristol tonight. Alibi claims to have been at pub during relevant time. Request your presence tomorrow. Interrogation. Craddock. Miss Marple removed her gloves thoughtfully and went to find Constable Polk, who she discovered making his rounds near the village green. I've had word from Inspector Craddock, she told him. Mr. Collins has been found and is claiming he was at a public house when Mrs. Merton died. The inspector has requested my presence at the questioning tomorrow. Found him. Have they? That's excellent news. Polk's satisfaction dimmed slightly, though. So if he has an alibi that complicates matters. Alibis, Miss Marple observed, are curious things. They can be true, false, or something in between. I find that the most interesting ones are those that shift slightly when examined closely. She returned home to prepare for the journey to Bristol the following day. That evening she sat by her fire, reviewing in her mind everything she knew a Booth case. Burton's confession had been genuine enough, she felt certain. His fear of Collins had been real. But there was something about Burton's account that had been troubling her, something she couldn't quite place. The next morning found her on the early train to Bristol, accompanied by Constable Polk. They were met at the station by Inspector who looked tired but determined. We picked up Collins yesterday evening at a lodging house in the Bedminster area, he explained as they walked to the police station. He was using a false name, but a sharp-eyed constable recognized him from the description we'd circulated. He's been very cooperative, actually almost eager to talk. That in itself is interesting, Miss Marple. Guilty men are usually either silent or defensive. Eagerness suggests she believes he has nothing to fear. Collins was brought into the interrogation room shortly thereafter. He was indeed tall and thin, with a pinched, ferret-like face that suggests both cunning and a certain desperation. His overcoat hung on a peg nearby, showed frayed cuffs that Mrs. Trimble had mentioned, but his manner was almost affable as he sat down across from them. I understand there's been some confusion, he said, his voice carrying a Bristol accent. I'm happy to clear matters up. Let's start with your movements on Wednesday the 14th. Craddock's day, Mrs. Agnes Merton died in St. Mary Mead. I was in Bristol that evening, at the Red Lion pub in Clifton from about 7 o'clock until closing. The landlord knows me. Several regulars will vouch for me. And yet, Miss Marple said quietly, you were seen in St. Mary Mead earlier that day at the post office making inquiries about Mrs. Merton and standing on the path near her cottage at 7 o'clock. Evening. Collins's but he recovered quickly. I was there earlier in the day, I admit that freely. I had business with Mr. Burton Dash, an old associate, but I left St. Mary Mead by the 4 o'clock train and was back in Bristol well before dark. What was the nature of your business with Mr. Burton? Craddock asked. Personal matters, financial arrangements from our previous association. Blackmail, you mean? Constable Polk said bluntly. We've seen the letters you sent Burton. You're extorting money from him. For the first time, Collins looked in. That's a harsh word, Constable. Burton owed me money from Bristol. I was merrily collecting what was due. And Mrs. Merton, Miss Marple asked, what was your interest in her? None whatsoever. I'd never even met the woman. Yet you asked the postmistress about her specifically, about where she lived. about her habits. Collins shifted in his seat. Burton mentioned her, said she was making difficulties for him about some escrow fund business. I was curious, that's all, but I never approached her, never spoke to her. Inspector Craddock leaned forward. Mr. Collins, we found the money Mrs. Merton withdrew from Thebin Call, £250 of it hidden in Burton's office at the school. In a lockbox, the Talso contained your letters to Burton. Can you explain that? This clearly surprised Collins. His eyes widened and for a moment he seemed at a loss for words. Then he said carefully, if the money was in Burton's office, then Burton must have taken it from her. I had nothing to do with it. The envelope had blood on it, Miss Marple said. Mrs. Merton's blood. It was taken from her on the night she died, during or after her fatal fall. Someone took that money to the school and hid it there. Was that you, Mr. Collins? No, I tell you, I was in Bristol. I have witnesses. Witnesses who will say you were at the Red Lion from 7 o'clock, Craddock said. But St. Mary, Mead us, less than an hour from Bristol by train. If you left the village on the 4 o'clock train, as you claim, and arrived at the pub by 7, that leaves you nearly 2 hours unaccounted for time enough to return to St. Mary Mead by a later train. Meet Mrs. Merton on that dark path, take the money and catch the last train back to Bristol. Collins's face had grown pale. That's speculation. You can't prove any of that, can't we? Craddock opened a folder and extracted several papers. The station master at St. Mary Mead recalls selling a ticket to Bristol to a tall man in an overcoat on the 8:30 train that night, the train that would have gotten you back to Bristol just in time to establish your alibi. At the pub before closing. Lots of men wear overcoats. Collins said, but his voice had lost its confident edge. Miss Marple spoke again, her tone almost conversational. I've been thinking about Mr. Burton's state of mind. When we arrested him, he seemed genuinely shocked by Mrs. Merton's death. He insisted, he told you, there would be no more payments, that Mrs. Merton was going to the authorities regardless. At first, I wondered if he was simply trying to minimize his own involvement. But the more I consider it, the more I believe he was telling the truth. Burton's a liar and a thief, Collins said flatly. In some respects, yes, but not about this, I think. You see, Burton's blackmail scheme relied on Mrs. Merton staying alive. Dead women pay no. He had every reason to want her alive and silent. But you, Mr. Collins, had different motivations entirely. She paused, letting her words sink in. Collins stared at her with an expression that mingled fear and calculation. When Burton told you the arrangement was finished, Miss Marple continued, you realized your source of income from him would dry up, but you also realized that Mrs. Merton had just withdrawn a substantial sum. Burton had told Yao about it perhaps, or you had deduced it from his conversations. You saw an opportunity to collect that money for yourself. This is all speculation, Collins repeated, but with less conviction. Is it? You were seen watching Rose Cottage at 7 o'clock. Then you left the village, but you returned later that evening. You waited on the footpath, knowing Mrs. Merton would come out after dark to meet Burton. When she appeared with her lantern, you confronted her, demanded the money. There was a struggle and she fell. I never touched her. Perhaps not intentionally. Perhaps you merrily reached for her handbag. She stepped backward, lost her footing. The result was the same. She did, and you took the envelope containing the money. Then rather than fleeing immediately, you did something very clever. You went to the school and hid the money in Burton's office, knowing that if it were found, the suspicion would fall entirely on him. Collins's hands gripped the edge off the table. You can't prove any of this. Actually, Inspector Craddock said quietly, we can. We've spoken to the barman at the Red Lion. He remembers you arriving much later than you claimed. Not at 7 o'clock, but closer to 9:30. You were out of breath, he said, and your coat was muddy. He noticed because you insisted on paying for drinks you hadn't actually consumed, trying to create the impression you'd been there all evening. The color drained completely from Collins's face. The station master's identification, the barman's testimony, the money hidden in a place only you and Burton knew about, then the blood on the envelope will place you at the scene. Craddock's voice was implacable. You can claim accident all you like, Mr. Collins, but the fact remains. You caused Agnes Merton's death, and you took money from her body. That's murder by any reasonable definition. Collins slumped in his chair, the fight going out of him. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. It was an accident. I only wanted the money. She shouldn't have resisted. Miss Marple looked at him with an expression of profound sadness. She resisted because you were taking the least of her resources, the money she had hoped would end her nightmare. She had already paid so much for silence on you, wanted to take even that final payment for yourself. Burton was their old thief. Collins said bitterly, your share of blood money. Constable Polk said with disgust, as they led Collins away to be formally tried. Miss Marple remained seated, feeling the weight of the tragedy. Twelman, both driven by greed, had destroyed a good woman's life, fanned, then her life itself. Burton would face justice for his theft and extortion. Collins would face it for something far worse. Outside, the Bristol rain fell steadily, washing the streets clean. But no rain could wash away what had happened on that dark November night in St. Mary Mead. Chapter 9. Voices behind the Dormith. Marple returned to St. Mary Mead on the Wednesday afternoon train. Weary from her journey, but satisfied that justice was proceeding as it should. Collins had been formally charged with manslaughter and theft, while Burton remained in custody, awaiting trial for embezzlement and blackmail. Yet, even as the case drew toward its conclusion, Miss Marple found herself troubled by certain details that refused to settle comfortably in her mind. She had stopped at Rose Cottage on her way home, intending to complete the inventory of Mrs. Merton's effects that had been interrupted by the investigation. The vicar had given his permission, and Miss Marple felt a certain obligation to see the task through properly. The cottage deserved to be closed up with dignity. Its late owners were since distraught, according to what few wishes could be determined, as she worked through the sitting room. Sorting books and small household items, she heard voices from the cottage next door. Miss Hardy's voice raised slightly in what sounded like distress, and another voice responding in lower, more measured tones. Miss Marple paused in her work, not from any desire to eavesdrop, because something about the exchange struck her as significant. The cottage square built close together, sharing a common wall, and sound carried between them with surprising clarity. I tell who I heard them, Miss Hardy was saying. That very night, arguing something fierce. I should have said something sooner, but with the sleeping draught and everything being so confused. The other voice, which Miss Marple nor recognized as belonging to Dr. Haydock, responded with professional calm. You've been under considerable strain, Miss Hardy. The mind can play tricks when we're distressed. My mind is perfectly sound, thank you. Know what I heard. Intrigued now, Miss Marple set down the books she had been sorting and moved quietly to the wall that separated the two cottages. In the small dining room where Mrs. Merton's writing desk stood, the wall was particularly thin, with what appeared to be a shared chimney breast that might conduct sound between thick dwellings. She could hear Miss Hardy's voice more clearly now. "Perhaps you should start from the beginning. Tell me exactly what to remember." There was a pause, then Miss Hardy spoke again, her voice steadier. "It was before I took Miss Sleeping Draught. I'd said I retired early with a headache and that was true booty. Didn't take the draft immediately. I was sitting up in bed reading when I heard voices from next door, from Mrs. Merton's sitting room, I think, which shares a wall with my bedroom. What time was this? Just past 8 o'clock. I remember Bess. I'd been debating whether to take the draft then or wait a bit longer. And you heard Mrs. Merton arguing with someone. 2 voices. Hers was upset, frightened even, and Eamon's voice angry and demanding. I couldn't make out all the words, but I heard him say something about bringing what was owed, and her saying she'd already agreed to pay. Miss Marple's attention sharpened. This was the same phrase from the note she had found in Mrs. Merton's desk. Bring what is owed. Did you recognize the man's voice? Dr. Haydock asked. That's what's been At first, I thought it was Mr. Burton. It had that same sort of tone, you understand. But the more I think about it, the less certain I am. There was something different about it, deeper, harsher. And then I heard a second man speak. A second man. Yes, that's what's made me so confused. 3 voices in total all in Mrs. Merton's cottage that evening. Hers and 2 men. Miss Marple felt a cold certainty settle over her. She moved swiftly back through Rose Cottage to the front door and around to Miss Hardy's entrance. Dr. Haydock answered her knock with a look of mild surprise. Miss Marple, I didn't realize you were next door. Forgive the interruption, Doctor, but I couldn't help overhearing. Miss Hardy, would you mind terribly repeating what you just told? It may be extremely important. Miss Hardy, looking relieved to have a more receptive audience, nodded eagerly. They settled in her small sitting room, and she recounted the story again, this time with Miss Marple asking careful questions. You're certain there were 2 different male voices? Quite certain. The first one, the one I thought might be Mr. Burton, was higher pitched, more anxious, if you understand me. The second was deeper, rougher, less educated in its speech. Collins, Miss Marple murmured. That would be Collins, and the other was indeed Burton. But why would they both be there? Haydock asked, clearly puzzled. Because Burton came to collect the money. Mrs. Merton had promised him, just as they had arranged. But Collins followed him, having decided to take the payment for himself. There was a confrontation the cottage between all 3 of them. Good heavens, Miss Hardy breathed. Miss Hardy, can you remember anything else they said? Any other phrases? Thatched it out. The woman closed her eyes, concentrating. The second man, the one with the deeper voice, said something about Burton not keeping his promises, and Burton's voice rose then, saying had told him there would be no more money. Then Mrs. Merton said, oh dear, what was it? Something about just wanting it all to end. And then what happened? I heard a door slammed, the front door. I think then silence for a bit. I assumed they'd all left. That's when I took Miss Sleeping Draught and heard nothing more until morning. But Miss Marple was thinking rapidly. If there had been an argument inside the cottage and then a door had slammed, perhaps not all 3 people had left. Perhaps one had remained behind waiting. Miss Hardy, your bedroom overlooks the side path, does it not? The one leading to the back of the cottages. Yes, though my curtains were drawn by then. Miss Marple, Tinetto, Dr. Haydock. I need to speak with Constable Polk immediately, and we need to question Burton again. His statement about that evening was incomplete. Within the hour, they had assembled at the constabulary. Constable Polk had sent an urgent message to Inspector Craddock in Bristol, and Burton had been brought from his cell to answer further questions. The school treasurer looked haggard, his earlier nervousness replaced by a kind of defeated exhaustion when Miss Marple explained what Miss Hardy had heard. His face crumpled. I didn't lie exactly. I just didn't tell you everything. I was afraid you'd think I'd killed her. Tell us now, Miss Marple said gently. Tell us the whole truth. Burton took a shaking breath. Mrs. Merton sent me a message that afternoon saying she would have the money that evening. She wanted me to come to Rose Cottage at 8 o'clock to collect it. I went, but when I arrived, Collins was already there. He must have been watching the cottage wait in. He pushed his way in behind me. Wilf happened then. There was an argument. Collins demanded half. The money said it was his right, since I'd built my scheme on his silence about Bristol. Mrs. Merton was... She said she only had enough to give me time to flee. There wasn't enough for both of us. Kellensburg came angriest that I'd been cheating him all along. And then I left. I swear I did. I couldn't bear it any more seeing what I'd brought down on her head. I slammed out the door and went to the pub, trying to establish an alibi in case anything went wrong. But I arrived much later than I'd claimed. Thieberman was right about that. So you left Mrs. Merton alone with Collins? Constable Polk said grimly, Yes, God help me. Yes, I was a coward. I ran away and left her to deal with. Alone, Miss Marple felt a wave of pity for Mrs. Merton trapped in her cottage with a dangerous man abandoned by the very person whose crimes had created the situation, and Collins must have followed her when she left the cottage trying to meet you at the arranged place on the footpath. She thought I'd be waiting there. Burton said wretchedly. She didn't know I'd already gone. The picture was complete now. Mrs. Merton, desperate to end her torment, had withdrawn the money and waited for Burton. Instead, she'd gotten Collins as well into confrontation that had sent Burton fleeing in fear. Then she had gone out into the dark, hoping Burton might still be waiting at their meeting place, only to find Collins there, instead demanding money she no longer had. The struggle, the found the envelope taken from her handbag. It had all happened just as Haid theorized, but with this additional layer of cowardice and betrayal. You should have told us this from the beginning, Constable Polk said. I know. I was afraid. I thought if I admitted being there, you'd charge me with her death. Instead, Miss Marple said quietly, you left her to die alone because you were more concerned with saving yourself. That is perhaps not murder, Mr. Burton, but it is something very close to it in moral terms. Burton buried his phos in his hands and Miss Marple felt no satisfaction in his misery, only a deep sadness for all the lives destroyed by greed and fear. Chapter 10. What her silence bought the Vicarage Hall was filled to capacity on the Friday afternoon when Miss Marple requested the word had spread through St. Mary Mead that the full truth of Mrs. Merton's death was to be revealed, and the villagers had assembled with that mixture of solemnity and curiosity that such occasions invariably produced. Mr. Clement, the vicar, had agreed to host the meeting, recognizing that their community needed closure and understanding after the shocking revelations of the past weeks. He sat at front beside Constable while Inspector Craddock had made the journey from Bristol, Specifically, Forthus Purpose stood near the door with Mr. Burton in custody beside him. Miss Marple surveyed the assembled faces. Mrs. Dane from the grocer's shop, Mrs. Trimble from the post office, Miss Patterson and Miss Thornley from the school, Dr. Haydock, Miss Hardy Andersons of others who had known Agnes Merton as a quiet, charitable woman devoted to the parish and its institutions. She rose from her seat, and the murmur of conversation died away. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "Know, these past weeks have been difficult for our village. We have learned things about people we thought we knew on. We have lost a valued member of our community in tragic circumstances. What I hope to do this afternoon is to help us understand how these events came to pass, so that we might learn from them and honor Mrs. Merton's memory properly." She paused, gathering her thoughts, then continued. 6 months ago, Mrs. Agnes Merton discovered that money was being stolen from the St. Mary Mead School Fund. As owner of the fund's managers, she had access to the accounts and her careful nature led her to notice discrepancies between their recorded payments and the actual work completed at the school. Mr. Burton, their school treasurer, had been creating false receipts and embezzling money for his personal use. A ripple of disapproval ran through the audience. Burton, standing beside Inspector Craddock, kept his eyes fixed on the floor. Double quotes. Mrs. Merton was faced with a terrible choice, Miss Marple said. She could expose the theft which would bring scandal upon the school and damage its reputation in the community, or she could remain silent, becoming complicit in the crime. Being the person she was, she chose what she believed was a middle path. She confronted Mr. Burton privately and attempted to resolve the matter without public exposure. She was too kind, someone murmured from the back of the hall. Perhaps, Miss Marple acknowledged. Or perhaps she simply understood that institutions are built on trust and that trust, once broken, is difficult to repair. She helped to protect the school while also holding Mr. Burton accountable. But Mr. Burton, I'm afraid, was not the man to respond to such mercy with reform. She turned to look at Burton directly. Instead of accepting responsibility, you turned the situation to your advantage. You convinced Mrs. Merton that exposing the theft would harm the children, damage the school's ability to raise funds, and bring shame upon the village. Then you asked her to help you cover the shortage in the accounts until you quadrupled what you had stolen. Burton's voice was hoarse when he spoke. It truly meant to repay it. I thought I could win it back, make investments that would return the money, but I only fell deeper into debt. And so the payments began, Miss Marple continued. At first, Mrs. Merton believed she was helping to cover a temporary shortfall. She kept careful records in a small black notebook, documenting each amount she gave you, £20, then £30, then £40. The sums grew larger as your desperation increased. She moved to the center of the hall, addressing the assembled villagers. What Miss Merton didn't know was that Mr. Burton was not simply in debt from poor investments. He was being blackmailed by a former associate from his previous position in Bristol. A man named Robert Collins. Mr. Burton had been dismissed from that position for financial irregularities, and Collins knew about it. He demanded regular payments to keep silent about Burton's past, threatening to expose him if he refused. Inspector Craddock spoke up from his position by the door. We found letters from Collins to Burton documenting these. Burton was stealing from the school fund partly to pay his own debts, but also to pay Collins. He was caught in a spiral of blackmail himself, which makes his treatment of Mrs. Merton the more reprehensible, Miss Marple said quietly. He knew what it was to be trapped by someone else's demands, yea, they imposed the same torment upon a woman who had shown him nothing but kindness and discretion. She paused, allowing this to sink in, then continued with the narrative. Eventually, Mrs. Merton realized that the payments would never end. She saw that Mr. Burton could not repay Waith had taken, that the situation was spiraling beyond control. She made a decision to go to the school board and confess everything, accepting whatever consequences might follow. But before she did so, she offered Burton one final payment, £250, a substantial sum representing most of her savings. She gave him this money to allow him time to flee the country where she made her report. It was an act of extraordinary mercy toward a man who had betrayed her trust repeatedly. She was a saint, Miss Hardy said, tears streaming down her face. She was a human being, Miss Marple corrected gently, who made choices based on compassion and a desire to minimize harm. But her mercy was her undoing because Mr. Burton's former associate, Robert Collins, had learned about the arrangement. She explained how Collins had come to St. Mary, Mead making inquiries about Mrs. Merton, her movements, how he'd overheard the teachers discussing her argument with Burton by the whispering wall at the school, how he had decided to claim the final payment for himself on the night of her death. Mrs. Merton expected to meet Mr. Burton at 8 o'clock at Rose Cottage. She had the money ready in a brown manila envelope, but when Mr. Burton arrived, Collins was already there, having followed him. There was a confrontation inside the cottage witnessed by Miss Hardy through the shared wall between the cottages. Miss Hardy nodded confirmation, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Collins demanded half the money, claiming it was his right since Burton's scheme had been built on his silence about the Bristol affair. Mrs. Merton, terrified and overwhelmed, tried to explain there was only enough to give Burton. The argument escalated down, then Mr. Burton did something unforgivable. She turned once more to Burton, her expression stern. You ran away. You left Mrs. Merton alone with a dangerous criminal because you were more concerned with establishing an alibi than with her safety. You went to the pub and tried to pretend you'd been there all evening while Mrs. Merton was left to face Collins alone. Burton's shoulders shook with silent sobs. Mrs. Merton must have believed that Burton had failed to appear at the footpath where they had arranged to meet. Miss Marple continued. She went out after dark carrying her lantern and the envelope of money, hoping he would be waiting there. Instead, she found Collins. He demanded the money. There was a struggle. Shefflin struck her head on the stone bordering the path. Whether Collins pushed her deliberately, or whether she simply lost her footing while trying to escape, him we may never know with certainty, but the result was the same. Agnes Merton died there in the dark, alone and afraid, while the money she had withdrawn to purchase freedom became an instrument of her death. The hall was silent except for muted weeping. Collins took the envelope from her handbag and left her lying on the cold ground, Miss Marple said, her voice hardening. Then, with remarkable callousness, he went to the school and hid the money in Burton's office, knowing that when the body was discovered with the envelope missing, suspicion would fall on Burton. He thought himself very clever. He returned to Bristol and established an alibi at a public house, believing he had committed perfect crime. But you caught him, Constable Polk said. Thanks to Miss Marple's careful investigation, we found the evidence that placed him at the scene. Miss Marple shook her head slightly, immorally observed what was there to be seen and asked the questions that needed asking. The truth revealed itself because lies, no matter how carefully constructed, eventually develop inconsistencies. Collins's alibi shifted when examined closely. The barman remembered him arriving much later than he claimed. The station master recalled selling him a ticket on the late train from Mary Mead. The blood on the envelope connected Dim directly to Mrs. Merton's death. Inspector Craddock stepped forward. Robert Collins has been charged with manslaughter and theft. He will stand trial in Bristol. Mr. Burton will beckage with embezzlement and blackmail. Both men will face justice for their crimes. But justice, Miss Marple said softly, cannot restore Agnes Merton to us. It cannot undo the fear and suffering she endured in her final months. It cannot repay her for the kindness she showed to a man who repaid her with extortion or for the mercy she extended to someone who abandoned her when she needed protection most. She looked out at the assembled villagers, her expression both sad and resolute. What we can do is learn from her tragedy. We can understand that silence, when purchased through fear or blackmail, exact a terrible price. Mrs. Merton tried to protect this school, this village, by handling matters quietly. She believed that avoiding scandal was worth the personal cost. But silence is never free, and those who profit from it will always return demanding more. In the end, her silence brought her nothing but death. She paused, then added more urgently, "We can also remember her for what she truly was. Woman of Principalejo, cared deeply about this community and its children. A woman who made choices based on compassion, and when those choices were difficult. Let us honor her memory, not by dwelling on how she died, but by remembering how she loved and by ensuring that the school fund she tried so hard to protect is properly managed and transparent in theft." The vicar rose and said a prayer for Mrs. Merton's soul. As the gathering dispersed, many villagers approached Miss Marple to thank her for bringing the truth to light. She accepted their gratitude with her characteristic modesty, that the real tribute to Agnes Merton would come not in words, but in how the community moved forward from this tragedy. Later, as Miss Marple walked home through the village in the fading afternoon light, she passed Rose Cottage, soon to be sold to settle Mrs. Merton's estate. She paused for a moment, thinking of the woman who had lived there, who had withdrawn money with trembling hands, who had tried to buy her way out of an impossible situation. "Silence is the costliest thing one can buy," she murmured to herself, "and it never stays purchased for long." Then she continued on her way, returning to her garden and her knitting and the quiet rhythms of village life, knowing that somewhere beneath that surface calm, human nature continued its eternal patterns of kindness and cruelty, wisdom and folly, sacrifice and It was the way of the world, and Miss Marple understood it better than most.